Welcome. Welcome to Bloomington Rotary Club's weekly celebration of service. I'm Ron Barnes, and I'm honored to be your president. The quote of the day: staying positive doesn't mean you have to be happy all the time. It means that even on the hard days, you know better ones are coming. Author unknown. Reflection today, past President John Dilts. John?
Good afternoon. I'm John Dilts, and I'm the chair of this year's Peace Building Committee. So we're going to talk about peace. In Rotary, peace has a special significance. Rotary International describes it as the cornerstone of its mission. Cornerstone, the cornerstone. Think about that. Whatever the Rotary mission, peace is the essential component. The cornerstone. Rotary, you might have noticed by now, is fond of construction metaphors. The four-way test calls for building goodwill and building better friendships, as though those things were structures. The kind of structures you build using tools like truth and fairness. Rotary talks about building peace in much the same way as a process of construction. When people work to create peace in their communities, says Rotary International's promotional literature, when people work to create peace in their communities, that work causes global change. How does Rotary build peace? Rotarians build peace by confronting the causes of conflict, including poverty, disease, discrimination, racism, sexism, ethnic tension, and the unequal distribution of resources like education and healthcare. So you build peace each time you come together. Each time you volunteer to help with a community project, like Teachers Warehouse, or buy a ticket for the Rotary Toast, or contribute to the Rotary Foundation, each time you remember to thank someone, each time you forgive someone, or encourage someone, or listen to someone. Peace is not the absence of conflict. We always have conflict. Peace is what you get when you build goodwill and better friendships.
Thank you, John. And also thank you for your leadership on this committee. Again, let the peace be with you. Our introduction of guests today, Dakir Abdullah.
Can everybody hear me? I don't want to speak too close into the mic. Should I get closer? All right. So y'all forgive me if I mispronounce some names here. But the guests who I'll announce, please stand when introduced so we can greet you properly. Our first guest is Elizabeth Mitchell, a guest of Jim Bright, and they're a documentarian. Our next guest is Annie Hawk, and they're from Brown County Rotary, a guest of Jim Bright, financial services retired. Next, we have Bev Murphy, guest of Jim Bright, retired school psychologist. Scott Stamper, a guest of Gene Hurley, retired healthcare. Here next we have Justin Bailey, guest of Tim Jessen, Archaeology. Following that, we have Rita Oates, wife of Bill Oates and guest of Bill Oates, and retired. Next, we have Eldon McCabe, guest of Teresa Clare, financial advisor. And lastly, we have Clara Stanley, guest of Jim Bright, Southport International Rotary. I think Joy will do the online.
Joy, do we have guests online today?
Well, whereas we do not have guests, I want to point out two Rotarians who are joining us this afternoon. We have Henk Heichema joining us from the Netherlands. Yay! And we have Kate Cruikshank joining us from Terre Haute.
And we have some birthdays. Amy Kendall on July 31st. Tyler Martin Nichols turned 30 on the 26th, our producer. And rumor has it that Tracy Jovanovich birthday's today. Happy birthday. There she is. And on August 2nd, Bill Perkins. Member anniversaries. We got some long timers with us. Mike Baker, 31 years. Bill Oakes, 35 years. Lee Witt, 20 years. Pat Smith, 4 years. We appreciate your membership and being part of this club. Now for Happy Dollars. And we have Tracy's gonna handle the mic. Are there Happy Dollars out there?
Thank you. I'm happy because our labor has almost come to fruition. Brown County Chamber Fest is going to be happening August 13th through 19th. It's a 7-day classical chamber music festival in beautiful Brown County, Indiana. So I passed out some brochures. I hope you take a chance to look at what we're offering. Some world-class musicians, the Chicago Symphony players, musicians from the Chicago Symphony, and some from IU and some from New York, and all around. So take a glance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Boy.
Hi there. I'm happy to live in Bloomington. There is a marvelous exhibit at our public library on journalism in Bloomington. And it's well worth your time. It'll be there, I think, through November. Is that right? I'm sorry, I said the Library History Center. It was the library when I came to Bloomington. So I just thank you very much.
Thank you. Today is Patrick and my 31st anniversary, so I'm celebrating. We're celebrating.
I wanted to celebrate the fact that my sister Bridget has recently moved here from Texas and purchased a house. That makes 3 Hurleys in Bloomington. My sister Ann has lived here for 45 years. I moved here in 2020. And if Bloomington can stand more Hurleys, our 2 other sisters are both visiting in August. So we'll see then. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Mitchell. I just completed my 2nd documentary about the first colored church of West Baden, Indiana. I'd like to invite all of you to the premiere. One of the premieres, we're going to have 2. August the 27th at 3 o'clock, Monroe County Public Library. This will be your chance to see it free. After that, you'll have to pay.
Hank wants to speak. Hank wants to speak.
Thank you. I would like to offer 20 happy dollars to my road to the club. I am grateful to be able to join you again. Binek and I are now settled in our apartment in Maarsen, and we're looking out on the busiest canal in Europe. It's boating, which befits the Netherlands. Thank you very much.
I have some happy dollars to celebrate our kitchen staff, specifically our chef Corbin Morwick and sous chef David Mitchell, who competed in the Chef's Challenge on Saturday night. The event raised over $27,000 for the community kitchen. It was fabulous.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your happiness. Looks like a happy group today. I would also like to thank the 10 Rotarians that worked with Liz Irwin at the food bank last Friday. We had a lot of, in fact, we were dealing with all of the material that was picked up on May 16th through the US Postal Service, and we got most of it taken care of. So thank you, Rotary, for your great community service. Now to introduce our program, Judy Schroeder. My head's up. Thank you, Judy.
It's a real honor for me to be able to introduce to you Alex Lewinsky, an IU professor of history and chair of the American Studies Department. Alex's research is about the intersection of labor and the civil rights in predominantly white supremacy environs. For example, the American South and South Africa. That's led him to some fascinating research. For example, the role of communism and anti-communism in the labor and civil rights movements. It's led him to investigate chain gangs and convict leasing. One of the most exciting things, though, that Alex has done is that he's led groups of IU students together with students from other countries to visit various significant civil rights sites. He led a group from University of Pretoria in South Africa with IU students, and just in May, a group from Novi Sad, the University of Novi Sad in Serbia. So he's very interested in getting out of the classroom as well as in, and he's been part of an arrangement of an exhibit that's been traveling around Indiana about anti-lynching and what has happened in our state and nation. So I'm going to sit down and let Alex speak to you.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me well enough? So, yep, let me set my timer up here. There's my slideshow, very good. Okay, thank you. First, thank you for that warm introduction, Judith. And let me follow up on that a bit by saying, I'm happy to invite you all to come see the anti-lynching art exhibit, which is called Unmasked. It was here at IU for 5 weeks last spring, but we just reinstalled it at the Crispus Attucks African American History Museum in downtown Indianapolis, and it opens on the evening of August 11th. So if I have time afterwards, I'll run out and get my postcards. I should have brought them with me, but if you feel like making a trip up to Indianapolis, I would really like to see that. And secondly, the tours that I led, I was really quite moved this week or last week, when President Biden announced the creation of a national historical monument around the lynching of Emmett Till And one of the sites that are part of that National Historic Monument is the courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, where Till's murderers were tried and acquitted in 1955. And that's where we took the students from Pretoria and from Novi Sad. So I was very pleased to see that the people who've been running that sort of historic site on a shoestring now are part of a recognized National Historic Monument. And I urge you to read Biden's statement on that, which was really quite profound and moving, especially at a moment in which the ability to teach the history of American race and racism honestly is under assault, quite frankly, in many places. So that's sort of a preface to what I'm going to talk about today. Let me find my slide advancer. Okay, good. So this is probably the toughest lecture I've ever had to give because I'm confined to 20 minutes, all right? And those of you who have had the pleasure or perhaps not pleasure of listening to academics lecture to you or at you know that it's very hard for us to stick to 20 minutes. But I am going to do my absolute level best to do that. I even have a little timer here. Okay, so what I've been asked to talk about in these 20 minutes today is really a single focused question. And that is the record of organized labor, i.e. trade unions, if you will, in the United States in advancing or perhaps retarding racial justice, okay? These are 4 different images that maybe speak to that very question. To put it bluntly, has organized labor in the United States acted, as some people have charged, with some justice as a racial job trust designed to protect the privileged position of white workers against what they see as the threat of undercutting by Chinese workers, immigrant workers, and African-American workers, Hispanic workers? So some people have argued historically that has been one of the primary functions of trade unions in the United States, or rather, has it served, has organized labor as a movement, a social movement, served as a vehicle of African-American advancement, equality, and solidarity in which class interests have been able to override or overcome racial differences and distinctions? That's sort of the debate that historians tend to have, and it's worth sort of thinking about and revisiting for a few minutes what the terms of that debate have been, because of course the answer is both. Both of those statements, I think, have a good deal of truth, and I'll try and sketch a few examples today based on a very, very rapid account of the history of the American labor movement to give you a sense of exactly what these divisions have been. So as many of you probably know, the preeminent and first real significant American organized labor federation, that is an umbrella group that brought together many, many different unions under its ambit, was the American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886 and still, of course, part of what we now know today as the AFL-CIO. Now, at its founding, as you can see on the top left, let's see if I have my laser pointer, at its oh, it's not going to work on that. Yeah, there it is. As you can see, at its founding and its early years, the leadership of the American Federation of Labor, let's say, doesn't look the way it might look today. It was all white and all male, and that was no accident. Most of the unions that made up the AFL were white and male, and I would even add native born. They certainly were hostile to women, African Americans, and in some instances, immigrants, although, of course, the leader was Samuel Gompers, and there are others who were also at one time immigrants. They were hostile to new immigrants, I would say. But it was more complicated than that, because in fact, the American Federation of Labor was a federation of different organizations, different trade unions, some of which explicitly did have in their charters that they were white only. Others of which were Black only, like the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters would be one example, led by A. Philip Randolph. Others of which in the coal industry and in longshoring, for example, that's in New Orleans. I'm not sure where that strike is, but the point being that there were other American Federation of Labor unions that very early on, and even at the height of Jim Crow in the 1890s, were integrated unions. I was really struck by this during some of my research a while back into the coal mining strike of 1894 in Alabama. I was looking at that in part because they were using convict labor in the mines to try and break the strike. Excuse me. But I was struck by the fact that even in Alabama in 1894, the United Mine Workers was an integrated union, not only having integrated meetings, not only integrated picket lines, but in fact, plenty of evidence that Black and white miners who were on strike hung out together and drank in the same bar in Birmingham, Alabama in 1894. That's quite a striking piece of evidence of the trade union movement being well ahead of the rest of the society in terms of its willingness to try and integrate. So, but that was an exception, of course. All right, that's important to recognize. So some affiliates did not discriminate, many did. And in many instances, when, oh, that's my pointer, sorry. When African-American workers were allowed to join the American Federation of Labor, they did so in segregated units. And often these were called auxiliary unions. So the white union, for instance, the railroad firemen would say, okay, Black brothers, you guys can organize a section of our union, but it will be an auxiliary and you will ultimately answer to the white brothers. So if you want to go on strike, you have to ask our permission, for example, right? So that was another kind of AFL union. Now, another dynamic that sort of posed the question, exclusion or solidarity, let's say, being the question, arose very sharply in the World War I era. As I suspect many of you know, this is the period in which African Americans began en masse to leave the rural South and to migrate to the urban North, both because they had had enough of Jim Crow in the rural South and because jobs in the packing houses and steel mills in Gary, Indiana, for example, began to open up as immigrant workers were squeezed off from coming to the United States, and many workers, of course, were enlisted to go fight in World War I. This was a major opportunity for African-American workers during World War I. So the question was posed, in this mass Black migration to the industrial working class of the North, would the existing unions try and defend their turf against these new workers? That often did happen, and indeed employers often brought Black workers into the mills and packing houses as strike breakers, which of course is very controversial and raised the question, or in the minds of white workers, if Black workers were somehow to be associated only with strike breakers. Or rather, would these new workers be incorporated into the existing unions? And again, on what basis? As separate locals or inside the same union? Now, on the one hand, I would say at this moment, let's say 1918 to 1920, the existing trade unions in the North did not have a very good record. And yet there was a glimmer of possibility, particularly in the steel unions and the packing house unions around that great arc around Lake Michigan. That's just 200 miles straight north from here, which was really the industrial heart of the country at the time, right? From the packing houses of Chicago down around the corner of the lake to the steel mills of Gary, where you had hundreds of thousands of African-American and Mexican workers coming up to work in the mills, sometimes as strike breakers, but sometimes you had a glimmer of what came to be called 2 decades later, industrial unionism, which did in fact incorporate these workers. Let me go back to this a minute. I forgot about that image I had up there. That one on the right, does anyone know what that, you have an image of the Chicago race riots that suggests that Black and white workers are fighting over the pay envelope. You have an image in the middle there, again, from the Chicago race riot of white National Guardsmen in the south side of Chicago with African-American residents. Anyone know what that is on the right? It's a painting. Can anyone identify the artist? I'm curious. That's the great artist Jacob Lawrence, who in the 1940s created 60 plus panels of the history, as he saw it, of the Great Migration. We actually, the postcard we use in our exhibit is one in which he notes that people were escaping lynchings, and that's why they would go to places like Chicago or Gary. This is an image that Lawrence painted, I believe, of the St. Louis race riot of 1917, in which white workers attacked in a pogrom, essentially, some of the Black workers coming to work in that region of the country. The possibilities opened up by a multiracial working class that's formed really during World War I at the heart of American industry do not really come to fruition until the 1930s, basically a generation later. And it's in the 1930s where you have a split within the American Federation of Labor and the creation of a new federation, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which offered a new opportunity for African-American workers and which, at least in its charter, in its vision, and in its organizing strategy, did in fact look to organize Black and white workers on the basis of equality. In part, the CIO was able to do this because it featured itself as an industrial union. Everyone working in the packing house, everyone working in the steel mill, regardless of their skill, or at least their place in the labor force, would be allowed to join the same union. Previously, the craft unions had dominated these industries, and craft unions used apprenticeship systems and alleged ability to gain skills as the ticket to joining the union, and white unions excluded African Americans from the opportunity to gain those skills and therefore join the union. The CIO said that doesn't matter. Even if you're coming in at the bottom of the labor force to sweep the blood off the floor of the packing house, you can belong to the United Packing House Workers of America. And that means you can do so whether you're Black, white, Hispanic, male, female, immigrant, native born, what have you. That was a huge breakthrough in the trade union movement. It really transformed the nature of American trade unionism, and it really transformed, I would say, the possibilities for the struggle against racism in this country. Some of these CIO unions were renowned not only for hiring Black organizers, steel industry in particular, but for also combating not just questions of wages, hours, treatment on the job, but going outside the gates of the plant to combat racism in the community. That's where you really see trade unions picking up that struggle in a particularly deliberate way. Particularly, and here's where Judith's introduction I think is germane, particularly those unions that had left-wing, including communist leadership. They made this part of their program, perhaps opportunistically, perhaps genuinely, but still that created a civil rights impulse in the trade unions. And that civil rights impulse was, if not driven out of the trade unions, somewhat clipped or squashed after World War II with the Red Scare. If someone had been an advocate of interracial unionism in 1936, 15 years later, 1951, that would have been a potential indicator that perhaps they were a communist and should probably be kicked out of the union. All right, so that's an important element of the Cold War that sort of shrank the space that the CIO could operate in terms of interracial unions and building those, and in terms of civil rights activism in the 1950s. And many historians argue, in fact, that the reason the baton or the torch passes to the church and to Dr. King was that the impulse for interracialism and civil rights activism that had been built inside the trade union movement in the 30s and the 40s was squelched by anti-communism in the Cold War. That's an argument. I mean, I'm party to both sides of that, but it's important to recognize that as part of the development. By the way, the image on the left, your left, is a steelworkers local union in Bessemer, Alabama in 1949, a so-called integrated union under the CIO umbrella that still had separate meetings for Blacks and whites. And even in that picture, they are segregated, the Black workers on one side and the white workers. Same local, same union, but they segregate themselves. World War II also was important in terms of the expansion of these efforts. Very quickly, I would say you have several elements. The government steps in with the Fair Employment Practices Committee, the first time that the federal government said, we will find a way to make sure that there is equality in hiring, pay, and the workplace. That's huge. That's in 1942, and that doesn't really come to fruition, of course, until 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. But that's the first time that the federal government says it is illegal for you to discriminate against Black workers, for example, not women workers. It was fine to still discriminate against women workers during the war, but and also the creation of what was called the March on Washington movement to demand equal access to defense jobs, led by A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. And the other development, however, during World War II, to look at the other side, was a series of hate strikes and race riots, often led directly from the workplace by aggrieved white workers. Aggrieved, why? Because they felt that Black workers were getting unfair advantages through the FEPC, right? So the image on the top left is the response, of course, to a hate strike in the Philadelphia transit system, where the white workers went on strike because they didn't want Black workers entering into skilled positions. Same thing happens at a shipyard in Mobile and the automobile plants in Detroit and so forth. Let me jump ahead very quickly now, because I am probably running out of time. Yes, this will work. I wanted to point to those developments during World War II because 20 years later, even less than 20 years, you have the very famous March on Washington, August 28th, 1963, which in many ways was the delayed version of the march that A. Philip Randolph had threatened in 1941. 41, Randolph says, I'm going to bring 100,000 Black marchers to Washington, President Roosevelt, unless you make sure that we get equal treatment in the armed forces, which remain segregated, of course, and in defense jobs. Roosevelt signed the FEPC. He had to sign it as an executive order because the Senate would never pass it, dominated as it was by Southern Dixiecrats, Democrats at the time, right? But again, the way we see certain members of the Congress now holding legislation hostage to their particular interests, this is what white Democrats did over and over again in the 30s, 40s, and 50s to block any civil rights legislation, so that something like the FEPC had to be an executive order. 1963 of the March on Washington, I love this photograph because it shows the sort of the crystallization of this long-term alliance. On the far left, Roy Wilkins, head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1963. In the center, Brother Randolph, right, who had been fighting for union rights for Black people for half a century by then. And who's that? Walter Reuther, president of the United Automobile Workers, which basically underwrote the march in terms of writing checks. And it's very important to remember that this march of 1963 was not just a civil rights march. It was a march for jobs and freedom. And it was, in Randolph's eyes in particular, and at Bayard Rustin's eyes and at Reuther's eyes, a march that was demanding economic equality as well as racial equality. And that, of course, results in the signature by Lyndon B. Johnson of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is a law, not an executive order, but it essentially, as I'm sure you all know, makes racial discrimination in all sorts of walks of life, but including in employment and hiring in the workplace, illegal, okay? Under the Commerce Clause. Now, I love, and also in this case, on the basis of gender as well as race. I love that image, give my mom a job, okay? And this is what, for the first time in American history, really, at least on paper, opens up the American workplace on the basis of theoretical equality. No longer could you run ads saying white people only, and no longer could a trade union say only white members allowed. That is now, and since 1964, illegal. Black workers, of course, use this not only to challenge hiring practices of their employers, but also to challenge the continuing racist practices of unions, particularly the building trades and other unions that had apprenticeship systems with very, you know how many Black carpenters and electricians and plumbers there were in 1964? Very few, because white workers kept them out of the building trades and had a lock on that. That's very much going all the way back to 1886, and it was perpetuated through 1964 and unfortunately beyond. Okay, now, one more slide. That's followed by some dissatisfaction, just as the civil rights movement led by Dr. King was followed by the Black Power movement in the late 1960s. So too amongst trade unions, there were new initiatives that came after 1964. Most famously, I would say the one you probably all know, which is the high point, I would say, of the Black labor struggle, and that's the Memphis sanitation workers strike of 1968. And then Black Power movements inside the trade unions, and particularly in the automobile industry, which challenged Walter Reuther, the great civil rights leader in the trade union movement, said, "You're not doing anything for Black workers. You continue to keep us out of the picture." So my point there, I think, just being this remained a conflict, a point of contention in the labor movement. Let me finish with why this matters. All right, and I was just thinking about that this morning. Who cares? Well, unions today, I think, do much more than they used to support minority and immigrant rights, in large part because there are many more women, immigrants, minorities, African Americans in the trade unions and in trade union leadership than there used to be. However, the white rank and file sometimes trumps that, shall we say. And we're about to face an election in which we're going to see, if you read the newspaper this morning or yesterday, it's an even split between Trump and Biden. Biden, the so-called most pro-union president ever. We can debate that, whether that's true or not, but certainly a pro-union president. And his putative opponent, if it is Donald Trump, is a man whose main experience with trade unions, I would say, is dealing with mobbed up construction trades in New York, which were perhaps the worst when it came to discriminating against Black workers in the entire trade union movement. So I imagine that the leadership of the trade union movement in this country will endorse, after a little back and forth, will endorse Biden. But what really matters is, will the white membership vote for Trump? And that's an open question. Thank you. And that was just maybe 1 minute over 20 minutes. So, all right, great. And feel free to ask me about the exhibit or my civil rights tours as well. I mean, it doesn't just have to be about my talk.
My question is about the Asian workers.
Hmm.
Were there enough to worry about, or did we just discriminate as badly like the, what it was called, that eliminated Chinese from
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Who asked that question? I didn't see who was asking. Oh, okay, good, thank you. Because as you saw from my first slide, I kind of alluded to this and I didn't go into much detail. And the reason I had that sort of Chinese exclusion slide at the beginning was it reminds us that at its very origins, I think one can argue that one of the things that made the American Federation of Labor, made the white working class join together into unions in the 1880s and 1890s was to block Asian immigration, unfortunately to say. In other words, this was their main cause, particularly in the West Coast. This is what built the AFL in a place like California, was we need an organization that will help us argue against the importation of Chinese workers. We want to exclude them. And actually that pamphlet that I had an image of up there, I wonder if I can go back to it, or is my slideshow over, is a pamphlet that said, rice or meat? The hardy white working man subsists on meat in the United States, but we're being undercut by cheap Chinese labor because they only need to eat rice and therefore they can work for much less. This is a really infamous and scurrilous pamphlet. There it is, Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Cooleyism. That's an American Federation of Labor pamphlet published in 1902 to advocate for the extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, did that persist? I think you're right in a way that this became less and less of an issue over time as Chinese labor became less and less of a so-called perceived threat to white workers. But to me, it's a signal that at its origins, the trade union movement in the United States was designed to protect white people against what was regarded as undercutting by non-white labor. So that's why I include that.
All right, first thing is a comment. Well, a question and a comment. So this was the exhibit that you were speaking of that was at the Cook Center that was in collaboration with Dr. Wolfskill and
Yes,
artist.
exactly.
Yeah.
Did you see that or?
Yeah, I was gonna
Okay.
say it was a fabulous exhibit.
you.
Me and Miss Holiday, Dolores Holiday, who is the librarian over the Neil Marshall Black Culture
Oh,
Center
right. Yes, I
Library.
know you guys came. Yeah.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
both went over there. We actually went twice. And one of the things that I liked that it highlighted was that, you know what I mean, like the Black liberation struggle wasn't just like a monolithic kind of phenomenon, and that communists as well as like organizations like the NAACP fought for similar things, but it was kind of funny that there was also some contention there in terms of like the communists critiquing the NAACP, and then also it highlight how the Communist Party also advocated for the Scottsboro case and things like that. This is my question. In any of your research, did you ever come across like the industrial workers, what is it, industrial workers of the world, like the Wobblies and Ben Fletcher? Or when you were thinking about the labor unions and integrated labor unions in Bessemer, did you ever come across like the sharecroppers union in Alabama during the Depression era? And then we also have, who was this? Did you come across Hubert Harrison and his work with the AFL and other labor organizations?
Okay. Do I have another 20 minutes? What you pointed to very nicely, and thank you for the shout out to the exhibit. And again, I think actually what you saw in the exhibit's about opposition to lynching. And I'm sorry, what's your name again? Okay, so Dakura, as he points out, in the exhibit, we highlight the contrast between the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign in the 1930s, which was a very powerful campaign, but which was fairly legalistic, and the far left, the Communist Party during the 1930s, which had a similar campaign, but argued, as they saw it, for mass agitation as opposed to legal reform. I mean, that's a very blunt way of putting it. But I think you can see that contrast within the approach to the trade union movement as well, if you want liberals and the left, right? So the NAACP might have said, okay, you know, we can build trade unions, we can join trade unions. The organizations that you've just highlighted, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Socialist Party and Hubert Harrison in the same era, let's say 1900 to 1920, the Communist Party, they would have had a different approach. Who are the other people you pointed to? Ben Fletcher's a Wobbly and IWW. So during the heyday of the American Federation of Labor, which I would say on balance was not particularly friendly to Black workers, there were alternatives. And these alternatives in particular were the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which quite famously had Black leaders like Ben Fletcher on the docks of Philadelphia, and which was trying before the CIO to build industrial unions, and which was explicitly open to African-American workers. There were alternatives even within the AFL, such as Hubert Harrison working as a socialist in Harlem who was trying to organize Black workers. And for that matter, A. Philip Randolph was a comrade of his. Randolph was a socialist in that period anyway, in the teens and 20s. And then finally, yes, in the 1930s, the Communist Party was trying to build unions amongst Black rural workers, such as a sharecroppers union in Alabama, in this area where eventually the steel mill unions came to predominate. So what you pointed to there very nicely is a constant thread of a more radical alternative to the mainstream trade union movement, which was led by Wobblies, who were anarchists, essentially socialists, and then the Communist Party. Yeah.
My question is related to the racism and tied to economics, where we are in an economic cycle. So during the Depression, was there more racism? Was there an effect in the unions? And then did that thread go throughout the past century as we've had economic downturns? Do we see racism pop up as jobs are more scarce?
Yeah. That is a really tough question to answer. It's a really interesting question because, as you have noticed, you have something that coincides. Let's just take the 30s as a good example. This is a moment in which people are desperate for jobs, right? There are not enough jobs to go around. Therefore, people are competing for work. Therefore, for example, white people say, well, don't hire any Black people. Those jobs are for us. That's certainly going on in the 30s, especially, but not exclusively in the South. And yet at the same time, it's also the period in which you see the efflorescence of a new trade union movement that's basing itself on the idea of workers' power regardless of race. That is the CIO in that case. So I do think on the one hand, you're right, we can trace these developments by economic cycles, but they seem to have very dualistic impacts. So they I guess now is a good moment. One of the things that's quite amazing, of course, is that, again, whatever you think of Biden, it's hard to deny that actually the economy is doing pretty well under Biden right now. And yet the same poll says 75% of Americans think the United States is moving in the wrong direction right now. I don't know how to reconcile that contradictory image, but I think in a lot of ways, certainly for the American working class, this election is going to be a referendum on these very questions. Are you doing well or not? If you're not doing well, is it the fault of the other, right? So will white workers, their unions are going to say, at the end of the day, you kind of have to vote for Biden, but the membership is going to say, well, we like Trump. We're going to vote for Trump because he's going to protect us and save our jobs or whatever. So I think there's no easy answer to that. This isn't a very satisfactory answer, but I think those are moments of polarization. I think that's the best way to think about it, where people can go in either direction.
You. Am I on? Thank you, Mr. Lichtenstein. I hope I didn't.
You got that
All
just right.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Jim. I just had the pleasure of visiting the National African American Museum in DC, and also went to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, National
great.
Civil Rights Museum.
And I took the Serbians to both of those, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I strongly suggest everyone, if you get a chance, to check those out. But my question is a little bit more here. Since DEI effort has come about, and after some social racial unrest, many organizations, and particularly those that are trying to work with diversity, start their meetings with labor and land agreements. In particular, the land agreements where we acknowledge Native Americans' lands, and then labor agreements where the country's been built on enslaved labor.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to know, what are your thoughts on that type of statement, its impact, its effectiveness, and do you even think it'll help in the area that we're in?
Wow. Okay. Let me start with the museums. I'm glad you visited both of those. They're very different museums. They're both fantastic museums. The one in Memphis, I think it's one of my favorite museums, and it's the starting point for my civil rights tours. The one in Washington is an extraordinary achievement. I actually know some of the people who helped design it. I love that museum, but it's amazing when you get to that second floor, I guess it is, and you sort of have the efflorescence of all these Black organizations doing this and doing that, and they don't even mention the CIO. They don't even mention the interracial union drives of the 1930s. I don't know why. I love everything about that museum, but that's a huge absence. Well, I was struck this morning, the Rotary Club, which seems to have, I love John's remarks about peace and building peace. I would submit that it might not hurt to have a land acknowledgement and or a labor acknowledgement at the beginning of Rotary Club meetings. It's something of an absence. That said, I think it's a good thing to say. It calls people's attention in a way that is significant and important, especially because we are now facing real assaults against any efforts, whether let's say, really making a difference. Like we just got an announcement this week from the graduate school at IU. Graduate applicants you will not be allowed to identify them by race. When you look at an application, it's now race blind because of the Supreme Court ruling just 6 weeks ago. I happen to think that's disgraceful, but it's now the law of the land. All right. I happen to, my view is I would like to exit this profession, that is the historical profession, when I retire 10 years from now, leaving it a little bit less white and male than when I found it 35 years ago. That's going to be harder to do now, which is a shame. So we're living in a moment in which those sort of operational efforts through affirmative action and other means are being constrained legally. and in which those symbolic efforts, which is what I think you're talking about, are also being constrained. I would imagine in a university in Florida now, which is where I used to teach, you might not really be able to do a land acknowledgement. It might violate the law in Florida now. Certainly people will challenge it. So my response would be, does it make a huge difference? No, but a symbolic action like that does make some difference, and it doesn't hurt, that is for sure. So if I join the Rotary Club, that would, I suppose, impel me to be more interested in joining it if such an acknowledgement was part of your very nice introductory speeches. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Alex.
All right, thank you very much. All right, got my phone, I've got my laser pointer. That's all I need. Thanks, great.
I can see why your classes are so popular. Just a wonderful presentation today. It was an honor to have you here presenting. And again, as a result, we also are sharing with you a token of our Rotary support by donating to Stone Belt for your presentation today. So thank you again, Alex. Acknowledgements. Our meeting would not exist without the help of all of you. And by the way, I'm going to ask Natalie to put a note out again for signups to be greeter, introducer, and all of that. But Steve Moberly was our greeter today. Takir was our, did our introductions. Of course, Joy Harder, who's our Zoom host. John Diltz, our reflector. Glenda Murray, our reporter again. And Tracy, who was our camera and Zoom operator, I guess, camera operator and mic operator. And then Tyler, who so well handles the technology and produces this for us. Next meeting will be again here in the Frangipani room, and we're going to get the opportunity to hear from our district governor, Shannon O'Toole. Now, board members, we're going to meet at 11 o'clock with Shannon in the distinguished alumni room down the hall. So that meeting will start at 11 o'clock for the board members. And of course, anybody that wants to join the board with that meeting, welcome to attend. Tyler, do you want to put up the four-way test? Let's stand for the four-way test. Please join me of the four-way test of the things we say, think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all? And fifth, will it be fun?